Today is the beginning of Catholic Schools Week, and so last night we had many of our Catholic school students here to be at Mass with us, and then had a pizza party with some music afterwards downstairs in the basement. It's always a joy to have them together at one Mass, but it also empties out our other Masses when they all gather together. So one amazing thing about our Catholic school is our Catholic school has been in existence for 64 years. And in those 64 years, there's many times of struggle, many times of plenty. We're currently at a place in our Catholic school, and one of the major difficulties of Catholic schools is salaries for teachers. But in our Catholic school, because of your generosity, we are able to actually pay our Catholic school teachers a decent wage. We're getting better and better. And coming this fall, we will be able to be at 90% of what the public school here in Colby pays. Now, the public school here in Colby is one of the highest in northwest Kansas and even in western Kansas. And so for us to be at 90% of that is a very good thing. And so our competitiveness for the quality of teachers when other teachers leave is a very good thing. So we're very proud of you all for donating to keep our school running and to be at that point that we can do that. Today I want to continue our talks about virtue, and just a reminder of what virtue is. The Catechism speaks about a virtue as an habitual and firm disposition to do the good. Or the classical traditional definition is the excellence of the perfection of a thing. And we even spoke about how we as human beings, we are called to become in the image of that which we love. And so God took on our likeness, he took on our flesh, because he loves us, so that we can be redeemed and we can be taken into heaven and share in his divine nature. St. Clare of Assisi says it this way: we become what we love, and who we love shapes what we become. If we love things, we become a thing. If we love nothing, we become nothing. Imitation is not a literal mimicking of Christ. Rather, it means becoming the image of the beloved. An image disclosed through transformation. This means we are to become vessels of God's compassionate love for us. For us to become vessels of God's compassionate love requires for us to become virtuous. And so the virtues are divided into the theological meaning hinge. All of the other virtues are hinged, categorized upon these four virtues. And those cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and the theological virtues are faith, hope, and love. So I want to spend our time this morning speaking more clearly about prudence and justice, the first two of the cardinal virtues. Prudence is the first of the virtues, the first of the cardinal virtues, because it disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. When I was in seminary and we were studying these things, I like to kind of simplify things and even probably oversimplify them. But the way that I remembered prudence was right reasoning. And right reasoning is knowing what is good and then knowing the right reasons to get to it. So knowing the end and the good end and the end that God calls us to, but also then knowing the means of how to get to that end. And I'll talk about that here in a second. Prudence is called the auriga virtutum, which means the charioteer of all of the virtues, which means it guides the other virtues by setting the rule and the measure. So all of the virtues are led and guided by prudence. So as long as we are striving for prudence and growing in prudence, all of the other virtues tend to come along with it. It is prudence that immediately guides the judgment of conscience. So that conscience is related to prudence. The prudent man determines and directs his conduct in accordance with his judgment. That comes from the Catechism, paragraph 1806. So prudence is the formation of the intellect to know what is good, so that we may do it, and thus to avoid evil. It is also necessary in the formation of conscience, for when we know what is good, and then we follow through with it, we become the prudent and virtuous person. Forming our conscience is necessary in our growth as a human person. The Church has taught, especially since Vatican II, that it is necessary for us to follow our well-formed conscience. That phrase has often been misinterpreted. It has been misinterpreted for people just to say that we have to follow our conscience. But they leave out that part that says well-formed. And the Gaudium et Spes is very clear that it must be a well-formed conscience. And so a well-formed conscience implies having the virtue of prudence. Prudence is not just about filling our intellect with knowledge and knowing the universal principles that apply to situations. Prudence then is also right reasoning in every respect, gaining even knowledge like applied knowledge. So general or universal principles as well as experiential knowledge helps to grow in prudence, so that we may also then know in particular circumstances how to act in those particular situations. So it's general, it's an overarching, like a 30,000-foot view, but it's also very particular to each of the situations that we find ourselves every day as well. Growing in prudence is also growing in human wisdom, so that knowing what is right to do, but also having the experiential knowledge, particularly through our senses and through the situations that we learn, we also grow in that human wisdom and that prudence. It helps to apply right reason to the enactment of means to morally appropriate ends. What that means is, I said that we know what is the right action for us to do. We know the end to which we are called, the end to which we are acting in this particular situation. But a prudence then also knows the right means, the right ways in which we get to that end. Because we can know the end, and there are immoral ways for us to get to that end, but we can never do an immoral thing to get to a good end. St. Thomas speaks of the integral parts of prudence, of which he says there are 8. I will only speak of 3. And the 3 I want to speak about are memory, docility, and shrewdness. Memory allows us to remember what we learn through either study or through our experiential knowledge, so we may apply the principles or remember what is to be done. Docility means to be willing to listen to others and to be open to the advice and wisdom of others. Shrewdness is the ability to have a clear vision of the situation at hand. It foresees the goal and the consequences of an action, considers all of the special circumstances involved, and then overcomes the temptation to injustice, lack of courage, lack of fortitude, and intemperance. This person, the prudent person, a person with shrewdness, acts in a timely manner, but with due reflection and consideration to decide what is good and how to do the good. So if it takes us a long time to figure out what the good thing is, that we probably haven't quite achieved the virtue of prudence yet. And so that shrewdness is their necessary part of prudence, to know what it is and to be able to do it quickly. It's part of having virtue, is to be able to do it with ease, do it quickly, and to do it with joy. The prudent person will have a well-formed conscience so that they may be attuned to God's truth and will act in accordance with the truth in that virtuous manner. And so justice. To simplify and even oversimplify justice, it is right relationship. Justice is the virtue proper to directing humans in their relations with one another, and most properly in our relationship with God. We don't often think about our relationship with God as being a relationship of justice. And also, if our relationship with God remains just at, well, I owe this to God, we're not actually deepening our relationship. It ought to be a loving relationship, because justice also deals with the love of neighbor and the love of God. So it's actually growing in love of God and our neighbor in justice as well. The first duty in justice is toward God. We have the duty to pray, to worship, to obey the God who has shown such great love to each one of us, and whom we must love above all things, and recognizing that justice requires right worship. There is a proper way for us to worship, even as Catholics. In justice, we ought to follow what the church says for us and how we ought to worship. If the church says that we ought to sing in a certain way, if the church says that we ought to pray in a certain way or even in a certain language, we ought to follow that. It is justice to God to follow what the church says about those things, about the way in which we worship. And we ought to continue to study those things, to fill ourselves with knowledge. That's what the prudent person does. To grow in justice is to know what the church wants, to know what it is to worship God and to worship him rightly, so that we can apply that in justice to our God. In justice to God, we uphold vows taken to him and make sacrifices for the sake of his love, such as accepting martyrdom rather than abandoning the faith. The second duty in justice then is toward our neighbor. A person must not only refrain from doing evil toward his neighbor, but also to do what is good toward his neighbor. As such, a person must respect the rights of each person and establish relationships which promote equity among all people and build up the common good. So justice has three dimensions. There is commutative justice, distributive justice, and legal justice. Commutative justice is the justice that governs relationships between two individuals. So strictly speaking, it's a sort of contractual justice. The meaning of the contract between individuals is to identify each person's rights and to guarantee one party's claim to a certain benefit as much as the other's obligation to provide for that benefit. And so holding up the dignity of the human person, even in our own personal life, of that person that we encounter in that instance, to give them the justice that is due to them. Distributive justice is the justice of the relationship of the community to the individual, what the community owes to the individual. Those entrusted with the care of the common good must make sure individual members are given what is their due. For example, in justice, the government must ensure that each person has proper food, clothing, shelter, medical care, educational opportunities, which are basic goods for the dignity of each person. Here, we recognize the duty of the whole community to care especially for the members of the whole, of even the most vulnerable, in a particular way, the unborn, the old, the sick, and the disabled. Then finally, we get to legal justice, which is the justice that the individual owes to the whole community. Every person has the duty to uphold and obey the just laws that ensure the common good. For instance, every citizen has a duty to support the common good through the defense of the country, or through the payment of taxes, and even in voting. Actually, if you are to read the section on our commitment to social justice, our commitment to proper justice, it talks about those who live in democratic governments who have the ability to vote for their leaders have a necessary duty to vote. And to not do so is a sin, because we are called to participate in the governance of our country and our state and our local elections, and we have the requirement out of justice to do that. So we want to make sure that we fulfill those things. And that relationship between the individual and the community then is to owe back to the community to work for the good of the community as well. Not just to accept everything that the government gives to them, but also to recognize that in their individuality, they owe something to the whole community as well. So to find a way to pull themselves out of poverty. Now, of course, there's many different things that go along with that. Their mental capabilities, their psychological, emotional capabilities that maybe are hindering them. And so we as a community have the duty to try and help them out to get them to that point where they can also be a benefit to the whole community and to give their justice back to the community as well. The virtues that derive from justice include piety. And under piety also includes reverence and service to our parents, our country, and even others in legitimate authority. The other virtues that fall under justice are obedience, gratitude, veracity, and affability, which means the proper friendliness and civility among all. And then, of course, equity falls under that justice as well. The thing about the cardinal virtues are kind of at the top of the list of the virtues, and there's many, many sub-virtues that fall under them that help us to understand and to live out the cardinal virtue itself. And so if I were to spend time talking about all of those sub-virtues, we'd have an entire class called moral theology that we take in seminary and even in college. And so there's much for us to learn. But it's good for us to learn those things, to read to read books about virtue, to learn to see what virtue is, how it is applied, for us to come to understand these virtues and to live them out in our daily life. Ultimately, our goal is to follow and imitate Jesus Christ. We do that by understanding how he teaches, what he teaches, applying those to our life so that we can be like him as we are called to be.